This may look a bit familiar. We're going to be doing some scary story readings. Now, I need to express this again because this is going to be a weird continuation of what we did last time. Last time we did this, we were reading The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. We got to chapter 4 and then we had to end it there. I'm not going to reread chapters 1, 2, 3. It's going to take us a long time to get to this point. These books also have a lot of subject matter and a lot of context, so I highly do recommend, if you don't know what's going on, go watch the previous spooky story reading so that you know exactly what is going on. Again, sorry for the split. I'll be sure to cut the VOD properly next time. We're just gonna jump right into chapter 4 and continue where we left off. A few months after Villiers' meeting with Herbert, Mr. Clark was sitting, as usual, by his after-dinner hearth, resolutely guarding his fancies from wandering in the direction of the bureau. For more than a week, he had succeeded in keeping away from the memoirs, which, if you recall, are like a series of evidences or books or writings from his friends and his peers about weird goings on in the world that he couldn't stay away from. This character is very attracted to sort of like mystery, the macabre and the mysterious in the world. His memoirs are full of notes on all these weird happenings, and he's starting to draw some like thread between them. And he cherished hopes of a complete self-reformation. But, in spite of his endeavors, he could not hush the wonder and the strange curiosity that the last case he had written down had excited within him. He had put the case, or rather the outline of it, conjecturally to a scientific friend, who shook his head and thought Clark was getting queer, and on this particular evening Clark was making an effort to rationalize the story when a sudden knock at the door roused him from his meditations. "Mr. Villiers to see you, sir." "Dear me, Villiers, it is very kind of you to look me up. I have not seen you for many months. I should think nearly a year. Come in. And how are you, Villiers? Want any advice about investments, perhaps?" "No, thanks. I fancy everything I have in that way is pretty safe. No, Clark, I've really come to consult you about a rather curious matter that has been brought under my notice of late. I'm afraid that you will think it all rather absurd when I tell you my tale. I sometimes think so myself, and that's just why I made up my mind to come to you, as I know you're a practical man." Mr. Villiers was ignorant of the memoirs to prove the existence of the devil. "Well, Villiers, I shall be happy to give you my advice to the best of my ability. What is the nature of your case?" It's an extraordinary thing altogether. You know my ways. I always keep my eyes open in the streets, and in my time I've chanced upon some queer customers. And queer cases too, but this, I think, beats all. I was coming out of a restaurant one nasty winter night about 3 months ago. I had had a capital dinner and a good bottle of Chianti, and I had stood for a moment on the pavement, thinking what a mystery there is about London streets and the companies that pass along them. A bottle of red wine encourages these fancies, Clark, and I dare say I should have thought a page of small type, but I was cut short by a beggar who had come behind me and was making the usual appeals. Of course, I looked around, and this beggar turned out to be what was left of an old friend of mine, a man named Herbert. I asked him how he had come to such a wretched pass, and he told me. Thankfully, this is also a very good summary of what's been happening so far, so this is a handy chapter to start from. We walked up and down one of these long and dark Soho streets, and there I listened to his story. He said he had married a beautiful girl, some years younger than himself, and, as he put it, she had corrupted him. Body? Semen demon. He wouldn't go into details. He said he dared not. That what he had seen and heard haunted him by night and day. And when I looked in his face, I knew he was speaking the truth. There was something about the man that made me shiver. I don't know why, but it was there. I gave him a little money and sent him away, and I assure you that when he was gone, I gasped for breath. His presence seemed to chill one's blood. Isn't this all just a little fanciful, Villiers? I suppose the poor fellow had made an imprudent marriage and, in plain English, gone to the bad. Well, listen to this, Villiers told Clark the story he had heard from Austin. You see, he concluded, there can be but little doubt that this Mr. Blank, whoever he was, died of sheer terror. He saw something so awful, so terrible, that it cut short his life. And again, sorry I forgot to let you know. These stories are formed sort of like the basis of like what was Lovecraftian horror, or like what is Lovecraftian horror today. These are kind of like the forerunners to like what we understand to be the concepts of Lovecraftian horror, but also form the basis of like the terrors that actually are named in them as well. This is one of the like great stories that like form the entire mythos, basically. But he he saw something so awful, so terrible, that cut short his life. What he saw, he most certainly saw in that house, which, somehow or other, had got a bad name in the neighborhood. I had the curiosity to go and look at the place for myself. It's a saddening kind of street. The houses are old enough to be mean and dreary, but not old enough to be quaint. As far as I could see, most of them are let in lodgings, furnished and unfurnished, and almost every door has 3 bells to it. Here and there, the ground floors have been made into shops of the commonest kind. It's a dismal street in every way. That's also the first time I've ever seen dismal spelled like that, with an I. Usually dismal is spelled with like a Y, or maybe it's not. Wait, is dismal ever spelled with a Y? Maybe I'm bad at spelling. You never really know. I found number 20 was to let, and I went to the agents and got the key. Of course, I should have heard nothing of the Herberts in that quarter, but I asked that man, fair and square, how long they had left the house, and whether there had been other tenants in the meanwhile. He looked at me queerly for a minute, and told me that the Herberts had left immediately after the unpleasantness, as he called it, and since then the house had been empty. Mr. Villiers paused for a moment. I have always been rather fond of going over empty houses. There's a sort of fascination about the desolate empty rooms, with the nails sticking in the walls and the dust sticking upon the windowsills. But I didn't enjoy going over number 20, Paul Street. I had hardly put my foot inside the passage when I noticed a queer, heavy feeling about the air of the house. Of course, all empty houses are stuffy and so forth, but this was something quite different. I can't describe it to you, but it seemed to stop the breath. I went into the front room and the back room, and the kitchens downstairs. They're all dirty and dusty enough, as you would expect, but there was something strange about them. All. I couldn't define it to you. I only know I felt queer. It was one of the rooms on the first floor, though, that was the worst. It was the largest room. Once on a time, that's interesting. Usually, nowadays, you may say once upon a time. I've never seen once on a time used. Maybe that was how it used to be said, or maybe it was a way to break away from fairy tales at that time. And once on a time, the paper must have been cheerful enough, but when I saw it, paint, paper, and everything were most doleful. But the room was full of horror. I felt my teeth grinding as I put my hand on the door, and when I went in, I thought I should have fallen fainting to the floor. However, I pulled myself together and stood against the end wall, wondering what on earth there could be about the room to make my limbs tremble and my heart beat as if I were at the hour of death. In one corner, there was a pile of newspapers littered on the floor, and I began looking at them. There were papers of 3 or 4 years ago, some of them half torn, and some crumpled as if they had been used for packing. I turned the whole pile over, and amongst them I found a curious drawing. Great. Thank you for splitting the sentence between 2 different pages, but ending the sentence with one single word. I'll show it to you presently, but I couldn't stay in the room. I felt it was overpowering me. I was thankful to come out, safe and sound, into the open air. People stared at me as I walked along the street, and one man said I was drunk. I was staggering about from one side of the pavement to the other. It was as much as I could do to take the key back to the agents and get home. I was in a bed for a week, suffering from what my doctor called nervous shock and exhaustion. One of those days I was reading the evening paper and happened to notice a paragraph headed, "Starved to Death." It was the usual style of thing. A model lodging house in Marylebone, a door locked for several days, and a dead man in his chair when they broke in. "The deceased," said the paragraph, "was known as Charles Herbert, and is believed to have been once a prosperous country gentleman. His name was familiar to the public 3 years ago in connection with the mysterious death in Paul Street, Tottenham Court Road, the deceased being the tenant of the house number 20, in the area of which a gentleman of good position was found dead, under circumstances not devoid of suspicion." A tragic ending, wasn't it? But after all, what he told me were true, which I am sure it was. The man's life was all a tragedy, and a tragedy of a stranger sort than they put on the boards. "And that's the story, is it?" said Clark musingly. "Yes, that's the story." "Well, really, Villiers, I scarcely know what to say about it. There are, no doubt, circumstances in the case which seem peculiar. The finding of the dead man in the air of Herbert's house, for instance, and the extraordinary opinion of the physician as to the cause of death. But, after all, it is conceivable that the facts may be explained in a straightforward manner. As to your own sensations when you went to see the house, I would suggest that they were due to a vivid imagination. You must have been brooding, in a semi-conscious way, over what you had heard. I don't exactly see what more can be said or done in the matter. You evidently think there's a mystery of some kind, but Herbert is dead. Where then do you propose to look? I propose to look for the woman whom he married. She is the mystery. The two men sat silent by the fireside. Clark secretly congratulating himself on having successfully kept up the character of advocate of the commonplace. Because again, we know he's been looking for these mysteries. He's been going through his memoirs, trying to find these mysteries. And Villiers, wrapped in his gloomy fancies. I think I'll have a cigarette, he said at last, and put his hand in his pocket to feel for the cigarette case. Ah, he said, sighing slightly. I forgot I had something to show you. You remember me saying that I had found a rather curious sketch amongst a pile of old newspapers at the house in Paul Street? Here it is. Villiers drew out a small thin parcel from his pocket. It was covered with brown paper and secured with string. The knots were troublesome. In spite of himself, Clark felt inquisitive. He bent forward on his chair as Villiers painfully undid the string and unfolded the outer covering. Inside was a second wrapping of tissue, and Villiers took it off and in the small piece of paper to Clark without a word. There was dead silence in the room for 5 minutes or more. The two men sat so still that they could hear the ticking of the tall, old-fashioned clock. Clock. Cock. Say it like cock. Cock, and then now add a single L. Cock. Clock. I'm saying it like his name. Cock. Cock with an L. Clock. That stood outside in the hall. In the mind of one of them, the slow monotony of sound woke up a far, far memory. He was looking intently at the small pen and ink sketch of the woman's head. It had evidently been drawn with great care, and by a true artist, for the woman's soul looked out of the eyes, and the lips were parted with a strange smile. Clark gazed still at the face. It brought to his memory one summer evening long ago. He saw again the long, lovely valley, the river winding between the hills, the meadows and the cornfields, the dull red sun, and the cold, white mist rising from the water. He heard a voice speaking to him across the waves of many years, and saying, "Clark, Mary will see the god Pan." And he was standing in the grim room beside the doctor, listening to the heavy ticking of the clock, waiting. Clock. Waiting and watching the figure lying in the green chair beneath the lamplight. Mary rose up, and he looked into her eyes. His heart grew cold within him. "Who is this woman?" he said at last. His voice was dry and hoarse. "That is the woman who Herbert married." Clark looked again at the sketch. It was not Mary after all. There certainly was Mary's face, but there was something else. Something he had not seen on Mary's features when the white-clad girl entered the laboratory with the doctor, nor at that terrible awakening, nor when she lay grinning on the bed. Whatever it was, the glance that came from those eyes, the smile on the full lips, or the expression of the whole face, Clark shuddered before it at his inmost soul and thought, unconsciously, of Dr. Phillips' words. "The most vivid presentment of evil I've ever seen." He turned the paper over mechanically in his hand and glanced at the back. "Good God! Clark, what is the matter? You're as white as death." Villiers had started wildly from his chair as Clark fell back with a groan. And let the paper drop from his hands. "I don't feel very well, Villiers. I am subject to these attacks. Pour me out a little wine. Thanks. That will do. I shall feel better in a few minutes." Villiers picked up the fallen sketch and turned it over as Clark had done. "You saw that," he said. "That's how I identified it as being a portrait of Herbert's wife, should I say his widow. How do you feel now?" "Better, thanks. It was only a passing faintness. I don't think I quite catch your meaning. What did you say enabled you to identify the picture?" This word, Helen, was written on the back. "Didn't I tell you her name was Helen?" "Yes, Helen Vaughn." Clark groaned. There could be no shadow of doubt. Now, don't you agree with me, said Villiers. Then the story I've told you tonight, and in the part this woman plays in it, there are some very strange points. Yes, Villiers, Clark muttered. Here's a strange story indeed. A strange story indeed. You must give me time to think it over. I may be to help you, or I may not. Must you be going now? Well, good night, Villiers. Good night. Come and see me in the course of a week. Again, sorry, I don't remember everyone's voices that I gave every character. There's a lot of characters, okay? I also forgot to mention, as like a summary, this is harking back to the doctor, which is like, you know, there was no clear connection before to the lady that the doctor had. And at the beginning, the character Clark, now with the C, Clark, went to go see this like doctor. And the doctor poured some chemical and did something to this woman's brain. Well, she was like a 16-year-old, like a teenager, who he like said he like owned. Again, these are old like books, so they have some certain flaws in the thoughts. And she apparently saw the great godlike Pan, and I didn't know that she was going to come back in this way. This is like the discovery that, holy shit, that little girl who was taken in by the foster family, and I think the second portion, as well as Helen in the third, is actually probably Mary as well. This is kind of freaky because the girl in the second story was a lot younger than Mary in the first story. And now in the third story, she's dead, apparently, presumably, or like she's like still alive, or like, but she's much older now. Something weird is going on, and something weird has happened ever since she went in and saw the great god Pan. Wait, my dog is eating something. BRB. Sorry about that. She's really cute. But now we know that there's a bit of a tenuous connection. I'm curious how this goes and what happens. What is the great god Pan? Is it even real? What did Mary see? And why is she doing all this? Chapter 5. The Letter of Advice. Do you know Austin? Said Villiers, as the two friends were pacing sedately along Piccadilly one pleasant morning in May. Do you know I'm convinced that what you told me about Paul Street and the Herberts is a mere episode in an extraordinary history. I may as well confess to you that when I asked you about Herbert a few months ago, I had just seen him. You had seen him? Where? He begged of me, in the street one night. He was in the most pitiable plight, but I recognized the man, and I got him to tell me his history, or at least the outline of it. In brief, it amounted to this. He'd been ruined by his wife. In what manner? He would not tell me. He would only say that she had destroyed him, body and soul. Body? Seem indeed that man is dead now. What has become of his wife? That's what I should like to know, and I mean to find her sooner or later. I know a man named Clark, but dry fellow. In fact, a man of business, but shrewd enough. You understand my meaning. Not shrewd in the mere business sense of the word, but a man who really knows something about men and life. Well, I laid the case before him, and he was evidently impressed. He said it needed consideration, and asked me to come again in the course of a week. A few days later, I received this extraordinary letter. Austin took the envelope, drew out the letter, and read it curiously. It ran as follows. My dear Villiers, I thought over the matter in which you consulted me the other night, and my advice to you is this. Throw the portrait into the fire. Blot out the story from your mind. Never give it another thought, Villiers, or you will be sorry. You'll think, no doubt, that I am in possession of some secret information, and to a certain extent that is the case. But I only know a little. I am like a traveler who has peered over an abyss and has drawn back in terror. What I know is strange enough and horrible enough, but beyond my knowledge there are depths and horrors more frightful still, more incredible than any tale told of winter nights about the fire. And I have resolved, and nothing shall shake that resolve, to explore no whit farther. And if you value your happiness, you will make the same determination. Come and see me, by all means, but we will talk on more cheerful topics than this. Austin folded the letter methodically and returned it to Villiers. It is certainly an extraordinary letter, he said. What does he mean by the portrait? I forgot to tell you, I've been to Paul Street and I've made a discovery. Villiers told the story as he had told it to Clark, and Austin listened in silence. He seemed puzzled. How very curious that you should experience such an unpleasant sensation in that room, he said at length. I hardly gathered that was a mere matter of the imagination. A feeling of repulsion, in short. No, it was more physical than mental. It was as if I were inhaling at every breath some deadly fume which seemed to penetrate to every nerve and bone and sinew of my body. I felt racked from head to foot. My eyes began to grow dim. It was like the entrance of death. Yes, very strange, certainly. You see, your friend confesses that there is some very black story connected with this woman. Did you notice any particular emotion in him when you were telling your tale? Yes, I did. He became very faint. He assured me there was a mere passing attack to which he was subject. Did you believe him? I did at the time, but I don't know now. But I don't now. He heard what I had to say with a good deal of indifference, so I showed him the portrait. It was then that he was seized with the attack of which I spoke. He looked ghastly, I assure you. Then he must have seen the woman before. But there might be another explanation. It might be the name and not the face, which was familiar to him. What do you think? I couldn't say. To the best of my belief, it was after turning the portrait in his hands that he nearly dropped from the chair. The name, was written on the back. Sorry, I'm like stuttering. Quite so. After all, it is impossible to come to any resolution in a case like this. I hate melodrama, and nothing strikes me as more commonplace and tedious than the ordinary ghost story of commerce. But, really, Villiers, it looks as if there was something very queer at the bottom of all this. The two men had, without noticing it, turned up Ashley Street, leading northward from Piccadilly. It was a long street, a rather gloomy one, but here and there a brighter taste had illuminated the dark houses with flowers and gay curtains and a cheerful paint on the doors. Again, gay has two meanings. One is like, your sexual preference. One is like happy. So all these words like queer and gay, they're being used in like the old way, which is like weird and like happy. Not that you still don't use them, but like they've fallen out of use in favor of the words weird and like happy. So Villiers glanced up as Austin stopped speaking and looked at one of these houses. Geraniums, red and white, drooped from every sill, and daffodil-colored curtains were draped back from each window. It looks cheerful, doesn't it? He said. Yes, and the inside's still more cheery. One of the pleasantest houses of the season, so I've heard. I haven't been there myself, but I've met several men who have, and they tell me it's uncommonly jovial. Whose house is it? Mrs. Beaumont's. And who is she? I can tell you. I've heard she comes from South America. After all, who she is of little consequence. She's a very wealthy woman. There's no doubt of that, and some of the best people have taken her up. I hear she has some wonderful claret, really marvelous wine, which must have cost a fabulous sum. Lord Argentine was telling me about it. He was there last Sunday evening. He assures me he has never tasted such a wine, and Argentine, as you know, is an expert. By the way, it reminds me, she must be an oddish sort of woman, this Mrs. Beaumont. Argentine asked her how old the wine was, and what do you think she said? About 1,000 years, I believe. Lord Argentine thought she was chaffing him, but when he laughed, she said she was speaking quite seriously, and offered to show him the jar. Of course, he couldn't say anything more after that, but it seems rather antiquated for a beverage, doesn't it? Why, here we are at my rooms. Come in. Won't you? Thanks, I think I will. I haven't seen the curiosity shop for a while. It was a room furnished richly, yet oddly, where every jar and bookcase and table, and every rug and jar and ornament seemed to be a thing apart, preserving each its own individuality. And anything fresh lately? Said Villiers after a while. No, I think not. You saw those queer jugs, didn't you? I thought so. I don't think I have come across anything for the last few weeks. Austin glanced around the room from cupboard to cupboard, from shelf to shelf, in search of some new oddity. His eyes fell at last on an odd chest, pleasantly and quaintly carved, which stood in a dark corner of the room. Ah, he said. I don't know why I said like that, sorry. I was forgetting. I've got something to show you. Austin unlocked the chest, drew out a thick quarto volume, laid it on the table, and resumed the cigar he had put down. Did you know Arthur Merrick, a painter, Villiers? But little. I met him 2 or 3 times at the house of a friend of mine. What has become of him? I haven't heard his name mentioned for quite some time. He's dead. Wait, that's such a dry response. He's dead. You don't say so. Quite young, wasn't he? Yes, only 30, and he died young. I'm 28 and I feel old. What did he die of? I don't know. He was an intimate friend of mine and a thoroughly good fellow. He used to come here and talk to me for hours. He was one of the best talkers I have met. He could even talk about painting, and that's more than can be said of most painters. About 18 months ago, he was feeling rather overworked, and partly at my suggestion, he went off on a sort of roving expedition, with no very definite end or aim about it. I believe New York was his first port, but I never heard from him. 3 months ago, I got this book, with a very civil letter from an English doctor practicing at Buenos Aires, stating that he had attended the late Mr. Merrick during his illness, and that the deceased had expressed an earnest wish that the enclosed package should be sent to me after his death. That was all. And haven't you written for further particulars? I have been thinking of doing so. You would advise me to write to the doctor? Certainly. And what about the book? It was sealed up. It was sealed up when I got it. I don't think the doctor had seen it. It is something very rare. Merrick was a collector, perhaps. No, I think not. Hardly a collector. Now, what do you think of these Ainu jugs? Forget the book. What do you think about these jugs of mine, Ainu? They are peculiar, but I like them. But aren't you going to show me poor Merrick's legacy? Yes, to be sure. Villiers, I'm trying to run a business here. The fact is, it's rather a peculiar sort of thing, and I haven't shown it to anyone. I wouldn't say anything about if I were you. There it is. Villiers took the book and opened it at haphazard. This isn't a printed volume, then, he said. No, it's a collection of drawings in black and white by my poor friend Merrick. Villiers turned to the first page. It was blank. The second bore a brief inscription, which he read. Cele per diem universis, nexine horror secretus est, lucet nocturnis enigmis, ignibus, chorus agapanum, undic personet of Latin, lorem ipsum dolor, a tinnitus, symbolorum por orum maritimum. Yeah. On the third page was a design which made Villiers start and look up at Austin. He was gazing abstractly out of the window. Villiers turned page after page, absorbed, in spite of himself, in the frightful Walpurgis night of evil, a strange, monstrous evil that the dead artist had set forth in hard black and white. The figures of fauns and satyrs and agapans danced before his eyes, the darkness of the thicket, the dance on the mountaintop. The scenes by lonely shores in green vineyards, by rocks and desert places, passed before him. The world before which the human soul seemed to shrink back and shudder. Villiers whirled over the remaining pages. He had seen enough. But the picture on the last leaf caught his eye as he almost closed the book. Austin! Well, what is it? Do you know who that is? Oh my god. It was a woman's face. Alone on the white page. Oh my god. Know who it is? No, of course not. I do. Who is it? It is Mrs. Herbert. Holy fuck. Are you sure? I am perfectly sure of it. Oh, poor Merrick. There's one more chapter in her history. But what do you think of the designs? They're frightful. Lock the book up again, Austin. If I were you, I would burn it. It must be a terrible companion, even though it be in a chest. Yes, there are singular drawings, but I wonder what connection there could be between Merrick and Mrs. Herbert, and what link between her and these designs. Oh, I know, we know, when she, as Mary, saw the great god Pan. Who can say? It's possible that the matter may end here. We shall never know. But in my own opinion, this Helen Vaughn, or Mrs. Herbert, is only the beginning. She'll come back to London, Austin. She will come back to London, Austin. Depend on it. She will come back, and we shall hear more about her then. I doubt it would be very pleasant news. That's a very short chapter. Okay, now we're starting to really get into some weird, freaky shit. Clearly, she's sharing these visions with the people that she's with. Right? Herbert mentioned that he was haunted by something, and now Merrick, someone who has actual artistical talent, can actually draw these so that we can see what he sees as well. Now we know. Now we know something. Something strange is going on. And I'm not ready for this. The what? Chapter 6. the suicides. Lord Argentine was a great favorite in London society. Oh my god, rest in peace, Lord Argentine. At 20, he had been a poor man, decked with the surname of an illustrious family, but forced to earn a livelihood as best he could, and the most speculative of moneyed lenders would not have entrusted him with £50 on the chance of his ever changing his name for a title, and his poverty for a great fortune. His father had been near enough to the fountain of good things to secure one of the family livings, but the son, even if he had taken orders, would scarcely obtain so much as this, and moreover felt no vocation for the ecclesiastical estate. Thus, he fronted the world with no better armor than the bachelor's gown and the wits of a younger son's grandson, with which equipment he contrived in some way to make a very tolerable fight of it. At 25, Mr. Charles Arbenon saw himself still a man of struggles and of warfare with the world. But out of the 7 who stood before him, in the high places of his family, 3 only remained. These 3, however, were good lives, but yet not proof against the Zulu asagus and typhoid fever. And so one morning, Arbenon woke up and found himself Lord Argentine, a man of 30 who had faced the difficulties of existence and had conquered. The situation amused him immensely, and he resolved that riches should be as pleasant to him as poverty had always been. Argentine, under some little consideration, came to the conclusion that dining, regarded as a fine art, was perhaps the most amusing pursuit open to fallen humanity, and thus his dinners became famous in London, and an invitation to his table a thing covetously desired. After 10 years of lordship and dinners, Argentine still declined to be jaded, still persisted in enjoying life, and by a kind of infection had become recognized as the cause of joy in others, in short, as the best of company. Sorry, I keep pausing and I don't know why. I need to... Think, Stick, think! Look at the words, say them! His sudden and tragical death therefore caused a wide and deep sensation. People could scarcely believe it, even though the newspaper was before their eyes, and the name of mysterious death of a nobleman came ringing up from the street. But there stood the brief paragraph. Lord Argentine was found dead this morning by his valet under distressing circumstances. It is stated that there can be no doubt that his lordship committed suicide, though no motive can be assigned for the act. The deceased nobleman was widely known in society and much liked for his genial manner and sumptuous hospitality. He is succeeded by etc., etc. By slow degrees the details came to light, but the case still remained a mystery. The chief witness at the inquest was the deceased's valet, who said that the night before his death, Lord Argentine had dined with a lady of good position, whose name was suppressed in the newspaper reports. At about 11 o'clock, Lord Argentine had returned, and informed his man that he should not require his services till the next morning. A little later, the valet had the occasion to cross the hall, and was somewhat astonished to see his master quietly letting himself out at the front door. He had taken off his evening clothes and was dressed in a Norfolk coat and knickerbockers. What is a knickerbocker? What the fuck is that? Sorry, that word surprised me. It's like, what is that? Yo, those look like the most comfortable pants I've ever seen in my entire life. If you don't know what they are, Google them. They are the best looking pants ever. Jesus, I would wear that. They look so comfortable. And wore a low brown hat. The valet had no reason to suppose that Lord Argentine had seen him, and though his master rarely kept late hours, thought little of the occurrence till the next morning, when he knocked at the bedroom door at 9:15 as usual. He received no answer, and, after knocking 2 or 3 times, entered the room, and saw Lord Argentine's body leaning forward at an angle from the bottom of the bed. He found that his master had tied a cord securely to one of the short bedposts, and after making a running noose and slipping it round his neck, the unfortunate man must have resolutely fallen forward, to die by slow strangulation. He was dressed in the light suit in which the valet had seen him go out, and the doctor who was summoned pronounced that life had been extinct for more than 4 hours. All papers, letters, and so forth seemed in perfect order, and nothing was discovered which pointed in the most remote way to any scandal either great or small. Here the evidence had ended. Nothing more could be discovered. Several persons had been present at the dinner party at which Lord Argentine had insisted, and to all these he seemed in his usual genial spirits. The valet, indeed, said he thought that his master appeared a little excited when he came home, but confessed that the alteration in his manner was very slight, hardly noticeable, indeed. It seemed hopeless to seek for any clue, and the suggestion that Lord Argentine had been suddenly attacked by acute suicidal mania was generally accepted. There was otherwise, however, when within 3 weeks, 3 more gentlemen, One of them a nobleman, and the two others men of good position and ample means, perished miserably in almost precisely the same manner. Lord Swanley was found one morning in his dressing room, hanging from a peg affixed to the wall, and Mr. Collier Stewart and Mr. Harries had chosen to die as Lord Argentine. There was no explanation in either case. A few bald facts: a living man in the evening, and a body with a black swollen face in the morning. The police had been forced to confess themselves powerless to arrest or explain the sordid murders of Whitechapel. Before the horrible suicides of Piccadilly and Mayfair, they were dumbfounded, for not even the mere ferocity which did duty as an explanation of the crimes of the East End could be of service in the West. Each of these men who had resolved to die a tortured, shameful death was rich, prosperous, and to all appearances in love with the world. Not the acutest research should ferret out any shadow of a lurking motive in either case. There was a horror in the air, and men looked at one another's faces when they met, each wondering whether the other was to be the victim of the fifth nameless tragedy. Journalists sought in vain for their scrapbooks, for materials whereof to concoct reminiscent articles. And the morning paper was unfolded in many a house with a feeling of awe. No man knew when or where the next blow would light. A short while after the last of these terrible events, Austin came to see Mr. Villiers. He was curious to know whether Villiers had succeeded in discovering any fresh traces of Mrs. Herbert, either through Clark or by other sources, and he asked the question soon after he had sat down. No, said Villiers. I wrote to Clark, but he remains obdurate, and I've tried other channels, but without any result. I can't find out what became of Helen Vaughan after she left Paul Street, but I think she must have gone abroad. But to tell the truth, Austin, I haven't paid much attention to the matter for the last few weeks. I knew poor Harries intimately, and his terrible death has been a great shock to me. Great shock. I can well believe it, answered Austin gravely. You know, Argentine was a friend of mine. If I remember rightly, we speak of him that day you came to my house. That day you came to my rooms. Sorry. Yes, it was in connection with that house in Ashley Street, Mrs. Beaumont's house. He said something about Argentines dining there. Oh yeah, he did dine there. Wait a minute. Quite so. Of course, you know it was there Argentine dined the night before his death. No, I had not heard that. Oh, yes. The name was kept out of the papers to spare Mrs. Beaumont. Argentine was a great favorite of hers, and it is said that she was in a terrible state for some time after. A curious look came over Villiers' face. He seemed undecided whether to speak or not. Austin began again. I never experienced such a feeling of horror as when I read the account of Argentine's death. I didn't understand it at the time, and I don't now. I knew him well, and it completely passes my understanding for what possible cause he, or any of the others, for the matter of that, could have resolved in cold blood to die in such an awful manner. You know how men babble away each other's characters in London? You may be sure any buried scandal or hidden skeleton would have been brought to light in such a case as this. But nothing of the sort has taken place. As for the theory of mania, that's very well, of course, for the coroner's jury. But everybody knows that it's all nonsense. Suicidal mania is not smallpox. Austin relapsed in the gloomy silence. Villiers sat silent, also, watching his friend. The expression of indecision still fleeted across his face. He seemed as if weighing his thoughts in the balance, and the considerations he was resolving left him still silent. Austin tried to shake off the remembrance of tragedies as hopeless and perplexed as a labyrinth of Daedalus. He not talking in an indifferent voice of the more pleasant incidents and adventures of the season. That Mrs. Beaumont, he said, of whom we were speaking, is a great success. She has taken London almost by storm. I met her the other night at Fulham's. She is really a remarkable woman. You've met Mrs. Beaumont? Yes, she had quite a court around her. She would be called very handsome, I suppose, and there's something about her face which I didn't like. The features are exquisite, but the expression is strange. All the time I was looking at her, and afterwards, when I was going home, I had a curious feeling that very expression was in some way or another familiar to me. You must have seen her. You must have seen it in the Row. No, I'm sure I've never set eyes on the woman before. It is that which makes it puzzling. And to the best of my belief, I've never seen anyone like her. What I felt was a kind of dim, far-off memory. Vague, but persistent. The only sensation I can compare it to is that odd feeling one sometimes has in a dream, when fantastic cities and wondrous lands and phantom personages appear familiar and accustomed. Villiers nodded and glanced aimlessly around the room, possibly in search of something on which to turn the conversation. His eyes fell on an old chest somewhat like that in which the artist's strange legacy lay hid beneath a Gothic scutcheon. "Have you written to the doctor about poor Merrick?" he asked. "Yes, I wrote asking for full particulars as to his illness and death. I don't expect to have an answer for another 3 weeks or a month. I thought I might as well inquire whether Merrick knew an English woman named Herbert, and if so, whether the doctor could give me any information about her. But it's very possible that Merrick fell in with her at New York, or Mexico, or San Francisco. I have no idea as to the extent or direction of his travels." "Yes, it's very possible that the woman may have more than one name." "Exactly. Oh, I wish I had thought of asking you to lend me the portrait of her, which you possess. I might even close it in my letter to Dr. Matthews." "So you might. That never occurred to me. We might send it now. Hark, what are those boys calling?" While the two men had been talking together, a confused noise of shouting had been gradually growing louder. The noise rose from the eastward and swelled down Piccadilly, drawing nearer and nearer. A very torrent of sound. Such streets are usually quiet, making every window a frame for a face, curious or excited. The cries and voices came echoing up the silent streets where Villiers lived, growing more distinct as they advanced. And, as Villiers spoke, an answer rang up from the pavement. "The West End Horrors! Another awful suicide! Full details!" Austin rushed down the stairs and bought a paper, and read out the paragraph to Villiers as the uproar in the street rose and fell. The window was open, and the air seemed full of noise and terror. "Another gentleman has fallen a victim to the terrible epidemic of suicide, which for the last month has prevailed in the West End. Mr. Sidney Crashaw of Stoke House, Fulham, and King's Pomeroy, Devon, was found after a prolonged search, hanging dead from the branch of a tree in his garden at 1 o'clock today. The deceased gentleman dined last night at the Carlton Club, and seemed in his usual health and spirits. He left the club at about 10 o'clock, and was seen walking leisurely up St. James's Street a little later. Subsequent to this, his movements cannot be traced. On the discovery of the body, medical aid was at once summoned, but life had evidently been long extinct. So far as is known, Mr. Crawshaw had no trouble or anxiety of any kind. This painful suicide, it will be remembered, is the 5th of the kind in this last month. The authorities at Scotland Yard are unable to suggest any explanation of these terrible occurrences." Austin put down the paper in mute horror. "I shall leave London tomorrow," he said. "It's a city of nightmares. How awful this is, Villiers." Mr. Villiers was sitting by the window quietly looking out into the street. He had listened to the newspaper report attentively, and the hint of indecision was no longer on his face. "Wait a moment, Austin," he replied. "I've made up my mind to mention a little matter that occurred last night. It's stated, I think, that Crashaw was last seen alive in St. James's Street shortly after 10? "Yes, I think so. I will look again. Yes, you are quite right." "Quite so. Well, I am in a position to contradict that statement at all events. Crashaw was seen after that. Considerably later indeed." "How do you know?" "Because I happened to see Crashaw myself at about 2 o'clock this morning." "You saw Crashaw? You, Villiers?" "Yes, I saw him quite distinctly. Indeed, there were but a few feet between us." "Where in heaven's name did you see him?" "Not far from here. I saw him in Ashley Street. He was just leaving a house." "Did you notice what house it was?" "Yes. It was Mrs. Beaumont's." Holy fuck. Oh my god, Chad, we're actually getting into some crazy shit. "Villiers, think what you're saying. There must be some mistake. How could Crashaw be in Mrs. Beaumont's house at 2 o'clock in the morning? Surely, you must have been dreaming, Villiers. You were always rather fanciful." "No. I was wide awake enough. And if I had been dreaming, as you say, what I saw would have roused me effectually." "What you saw? What'd you see? Was there anything strange about Crashaw? But I can't believe it. It is impossible." If you like, I will tell you what I saw, or if you please, what I think I saw, and you can judge for yourself." "Very good, Villiers." As an aside, I do like how back then, people didn't say right then, or like carry on. People said, "Very good," right? As like saying like a yes thing, right? They made every single thing feel much more complicated. Why say yes when you can say, "Very good" now? The noise and clamor of the street had died away. though now and then the sound of shouting still came from the distance, and the dull, leaden silence seemed like the quiet after an earthquake or a storm. Villiers turned to the window and began speaking. I was at a house near Regent's Park last night. When I came away, the fancy took me to walk home instead of taking a hansom. It was a clear, pleasant night enough, and after a few minutes I had the streets pretty much to myself. It's a curious thing, Austin, to be alone in London at night. The gas lamp stretching away in perspective, and the dead silence, and perhaps the rush and clatter of a hansom on the stones, and the fire starting up under the horses' hoofs. I walked along pretty briskly, for I was feeling a little tired of being out in the night, and as the clocks were striking 2, I turned down Ashley Street, which, you know, is on my way. It was quieter than ever there, and the lamps were fewer. Altogether, it looked as dark and gloomy as a forest in winter. I had done about half the length of the street when I heard a door close very softly, and naturally I looked up to see who was abroad like myself at such an hour. As it happens, there was a street lamp close to the house in question, and I saw a man standing on the step. He had just shut the door, and his face was towards me, and I recognized Crashar directly. I never knew him to speak to, but I had not often seen him, and I am positive that I was not mistaken in my man. I looked into his face for a moment, and then, I'll confess the truth, I set out to a good run, and kept it up until I was within my own door. Why? Why? Because it made my blood run cold to see that man's face. I could never have supposed that such an infernal medley of passions could have glared out of any human eyes. I almost fainted as I looked. I knew I had looked into the eyes of a lost soul, Austin. The man's outward form remained, but all hell was within it. Furious lust and hate that was like fire. The loss of all hope and horror that seemed to shriek aloud to the night, though his teeth were shut. And the utter blackness of despair. I am sure that he did not see me. He saw nothing that you or I can see. What he saw, I hope we never shall. I do not know when he died. I suppose in an hour, perhaps 2, when I passed down Ashley Street and heard the closing door. That man no longer belonged to this world. It was a devil's face I had looked upon. There was an interval of silence in the room when Villiers ceased speaking. The light was failing, and all the tumult of an hour ago was quite hushed. Austin had bent his head at the close of the story, and his hand covered his eyes. "What can it mean?" he said at length. "Who knows, Austin? Who knows? It's a black business, but I think we had better keep it to ourselves, for the present, at any rate. I'll see if I cannot learn anything about that house through private channels of information. If I do light upon anything, I will let you know." It's clearly, Mary, Mrs. Beaumont, Helen, they're all the same person. Whatever she's doing, whatever she's instilling in like people. And again, you see the sort of like Lovecraftian element of like madness, right? Staring at these gods, even hearing them makes you mad beyond belief. It was a concept that was even used in that one movie or show, Bird Box, which is also weird. That guerrilla marketing campaign was interesting. But it's a very common element of like Lovecraftian horror. To stare upon it, to gaze upon it, to then go mad. This is what we're witnessing. Chapter 7. The Encounter in Soho. 3 weeks later, Austin received a note from Villiers, asking him to call either that afternoon or the next. He chose the nearer date and found Villiers sitting as usual by the window, apparently lost in meditation on the drowsy traffic of the street. There was a bamboo table by his side, a fantastic thing, enriched with gliding and queer painted scenes, and on it lay a little pile of papers arranged and doctored as neatly as anything in Mr. Clark's office. "Well, Villiers, have you made any discoveries in the last 3 weeks?" "I think so. I have here 1 or 2 memoranda which struck me as singular, and there's a statement to which I shall call your attention. And these documents relate to Mrs. Beaumont. It was really Crashar who you saw that night standing on the doorstep of the house in Ashley Street. As to that matter, my belief remains unchanged, but neither my inquiries nor their results have any special relation to Crashar. But my investigations have had a strange issue. I have found out who Mrs. Beaumont is." "Who is she? In what way do you mean?" "I mean that you and I know her better under another name." "What name is that?" "Herbert." "Herbert! Herbert! Herbert!" Austin repeated the word, dazed with astonishment. "Yes, Mrs. Herbert of Hall Street, Helen Vaughan of earlier adventures unknown to me. You had reason to recognize the expression of her face? When you go home and look at the face in Mary's Book of Horrors, then you will know the sources of your recollection. And you approve of this? Yes, the best approve. I have seen Mrs. Beaumont. Shall we say Mrs. Herbert? Where'd you see her? Hardly in a place where you'd expect to see a lady who lives in Ashley Street, Piccadilly. In Ashley Street, Piccadilly. I saw her entering a house in one of the meanest and most disreputable streets in Soho. In fact, I had made an appointment, though not with her, and she was precise to both the time and place. All this seems very wonderful, but I cannot call it incredible. You must remember, Villiers, that I have seen this woman, in the ordinary adventure of London society, talking and laughing, and sipping on coffee in a commonplace drawing room with commonplace people. But you know what you are saying. I do. I have not allowed myself to be led by surmises or fancies. It was with no thought of finding Helen Vaughan that I searched for Mrs. Beaumont in the dark waters of the life of London. But such has been the issue. You must have been in some strange places, you Villiers. Strange places. Yes, I've been in very strange places. Oh god, here we go, another run-on paragraph. It would have been useless, to go to Ashley Street and ask Mrs. Beaumont to give me a short sketch of her previous history. No. Assuming, as I had to assume, that her record was not of the cleanest, it would be pretty certain that some previous time she must have moved in circles not quite so refined as her present ones. If you see mud at the top of a stream, you may be sure that it was once at the bottom. I went to the bottom. I have always been fond of diving into Queer Street for my amusement, and I found my knowledge of that locality and its inhabitants very useful. It is, perhaps, needless to say that my friends had never heard the name of Beaumont, and as I had never seen the lady and was quite unable to describe her, had to set to work in an indirect way. The people there know me. I've been able to do some of them a service now and again, so they made no difficulty about giving their information. They were aware I had no communication direct or indirect with Scotland Yard. I had cast out a good many lines, though, before I got what I wanted, and when I landed the fish, I had not for a moment supposed it was my fish. But I listened to what I was told out of a constitutional liking for useless information, and I found myself in possession of a very curious story. Though, as I imagined, not the story I was looking for. It was to this effect. Some 5 or 6 years ago, a woman named Raymond suddenly made her appearance in the neighborhood to which I am referring. Holy shit. Raymond was the character, I believe, in chapter 2 or 3. Chapter 2, I believe. The woman who was like a foster child. She was described to me as being quite young, probably not more than 17 or 18, very handsome, looking as if she came from the country. I should be wrong in saying that she found her level in going to this particular quarter, or associating with these people, for from what I was told, I should think the worst den in London far too good for her. The person from whom I got my information, as you may suppose, no great Puritan, shuddered and grew sick in telling me of the nameless infamies which were laid to her charge. After living there for a year, perhaps a little more, she disappeared as suddenly as she came, and they said nothing of her till about the time of the Paul Street case. At first, she came to her old haunts only occasionally, then more frequently, and finally took up her abode there as before, remained for 6 or 8 months. It's of no use my going into details as to the life that woman led. If you want particulars, you can look at Merrick's legacy. Those designs were not drawn from his imagination. Oh my god. She again disappeared, and the people of the place saw nothing of her until a few months ago. My informant told me that she had taken some rooms in the house which he had pointed out, and these rooms she was in the habit of visiting 2 or 3 times a week, and always at 10 in the morning. I was led to expect that one of these visits would be paid on a certain day about a week ago, and I accordingly managed to be on the lookout in company with my sister around at a quarter to 10. And the hour and the lady came with equal punctuality. My friend and I were standing under an archway, a little way back from the street, but she saw us, and gave me a glance that I shall be long in forgetting. That look was quite enough for me. I knew Miss Raymond to be Mrs. Herbert. As for Mrs. Beaumont, she had gone quite out of my mind. She went into the house, and I watched it till 4 o'clock when she came out, and then I followed her. It was a long chase, and I had to be very careful to keep a long way in the background, yet not lose sight of the woman. She took me down to the Strand, and then to Westminster, and then up St. James Street, and along Piccadilly. I felt queerish when I saw her turn up Ashley Street. The thought that Mrs. Herbert was Miss Beaumont came into my mind, but it seemed too impossible to be true. I waited at the corner, keeping my eye on her all the time. I took particular care to note the house at which she stopped. It was the house with the gay curtains. The one with flowers. The house out of which Crasher came the night he hanged himself in his garden. I was just going away with my discovery when I saw an empty carriage come around and drop in front of the house. I came to the conclusion that Mrs. Herbert was going out for a drive, and I was right. There, as it happened, I met a man I know. We stood talking together a little distance from the carriageway, to which I had my back. We had not been there for 10 minutes. My friend took off his hat, and I glanced around and saw the lady I had been following all day. "Who was that?" I said. And his answer was, "Oh, Mrs. Beaumont. Lives in Ashley Street." Of course, there could be no doubt after that. I don't know whether she saw me, but I don't think she did. Went home at once, and on consideration, I thought I had a sufficiently good case with which to go to Clark. Why to Clark? Because I am sure that Clark is in possession of facts about this woman. Facts of which I know nothing. Well, what then? Mr. Villiers leaned back in his chair and looked reflectively at Austin for a moment before he answered. My idea was that Clark and I should call on Mrs. Beaumont. You would never go into such a house as that. No, Villiers, you cannot do that. Besides, consider what results... I will tell you soon. But I was going to say that my information does not end here. It has been completed in an extraordinary manner. Look at this neat little packet in manuscript. It is paginated, you see, and I have indulged it in the civil coquetry of a ribbon of red tape. It has almost a legal air, hasn't it? Run your eye over it, Austin. It is an account of the entertainment Mrs. Beaumont provided for her choicier guests. The man who wrote this escaped with his life, but I do not think he will live many years. The doctors tell me he must have sustained some severe shock to the nerves. Austin took the manuscript, but never read it. Opening the neat pages at haphazard, his eye was caught by a word and a phrase that followed it. And, sick at heart, with white lips and a cold sweat pouring like water from his temples, he flung the paper down. Take it away, Villiers. Never speak of this again. You're made of stone, man. Why, the dread and horror of death itself. The thoughts of the man who stands in the keen morning air on a black platform, bound, the bell tolling in his ears, and wait for the harsh rattle of the balls, is nothing compared to this. I will not read it. I should never sleep again. Very good. I can fancy what you saw. Yes, it is horrible enough. But after all, it is an old story. An old mystery played in a day. In dim London streets instead of amidst the vineyards and the olive gardens. We know what happened to those who chanced to meet the great god Pan. And those who are wise know that all symbols are symbols of something, not of nothing. It was, indeed, an exquisite symbol beneath which men long ago veiled their knowledge of the most awful, most secret forces which lie at the heart of all things. Forces before which the souls of men must wither and die and blacken as their bodies blacken under the electric current. Such forces cannot be named, cannot be spoken, cannot be imagined except under a veil and a symbol to the most of us appearing a quaint, poetic fancy to some foolish tale. But you and I, at all events, have known something of the terror that may dwell in the secret place of life, manifested under human flesh. But that which is without form taking to itself a form. Austin, how can it be? How is it that the very sunlight does not turn to blackness before this thing? That the hard earth melts and boil beneath such a burden? Villiers was pacing up and down the room, the beads of sweat settled on his forehead. Austin sat silent for a while, but Villiers saw him make a sign upon his breast. I say again, Villiers, you will surely never enter a house as that? You would never pass out alive! Yes, Austin, I shall go out alive. I, and Clark with me. What do you mean? You cannot. You would not dare. Wait a moment. The air was very pleasant and fresh this morning. There was a breeze blowing, even through this dull street, and I thought I would take a walk. Piccadilly stretched before me a clear, bright vista. The sun flashed on the carriages and on the quivering leaves in the park. It was a joyous morning, and men and women looked at the sky and smiled as they went about their work or their pleasure, and the wind blew as blithely as upon the meadows and the scented gorse. But somehow or other, I got out of the bustle and the gaiety, and found myself walking slowly along a quiet, dull street, where there seemed to be no sunshine and no air, and where the few foot passengers loitered as they walked, and hung indecisive about corners and archways. I walked along, hardly knowing where I was going or what I did there, but feeling impelled, as one sometimes is, to explore still further, with a vague idea of reaching some unknown goal. Thus I forged up the streets, noticing the small traffic at the milk shop, and wondering at the incongruous medley of penny pipes, black tobacco, sweets, newspapers, and comic songs, which here and there jostled one another in the short compass of a single window. I think it was a cold shudder that suddenly passed through me that first told me that I'd found what I wanted. I looked up from the pavement and stopped before a dusty shop, above which the lettering had faded, where the red bricks of 200 years ago had grimed to black, where the windows had gathered to themselves the dust of winters innumerable. I saw what I required, but it was 5 minutes before I steadied myself and could walk in and ask for it in a cool voice and with a calm face. I think there must even then have been a tremor in my words, for the old man who came out of the back parlor and fumbled slowly amongst his goods looked oddly at me as he tied the parcel. I paid what he asked and stood leaning by the counter, with a strange reluctance to take up my goods and go. I asked about the business and learned that trade was bad and the profits were cut down sadly. Then the street was not what it was before traffic had been diverted, but that was done 40 years ago, just before my father died, he said. I got away at last and walked along sharply. It was a dismal street indeed, and I was glad to return to the bustle and noise. Would you like to see my purchase? Austin said nothing, but nodded his head slightly. He still looked white and sick. Villiers pulled out a drawer in the bamboo table and showed Austin a long coil of cord, hard and new. And at one end was a running noose. "It is the best hempen cord," said Villiers. Just as it used to be made for the old trade, the man told me. Just as it used to be made for the old trade, the man told me. Not an inch of jute from end to end. Austin set his teeth hard and stared at Villiers, growing whiter as he looked. "You would not do it," he murmured at last. "You would not have blood in your hands." "My God," he exclaimed with sudden vehemence. "You cannot mean this, Villiers, that you will make yourself a hangman?" "No, I shall offer a choice, and leave Helen Vaughn alone with this cord in the locked room for 15 minutes. If when we go in it is not done, I shall call the nearest policeman. That is all. I must go now. I cannot stay here any longer. Oh wait, I must go now. And I cannot stay here any longer. I cannot bear this. Good night." "Good night, Austin." The door shut, but in a moment it was open again, and Austin stood, white and ghastly, in the entrance. "I was forgetting," he said, "that I too have something to tell. I received a letter from Dr. Harding of Buenos Aires. He says that he attended Merrick for 3 weeks before his death. Does he say what carried him off in the prime of life? It was not fever." "No, it was not fever. According to the doctor, it was utter collapse of the whole system, probably caused by some severe shock. But it states that the patient would tell him nothing, and that he was consequently at some disadvantage in treating the case. Is there anything more?" "Yes. Dr. Harding ends his letter by saying, 'I think this is all the information I can give you about your poor friend. He had not been long in Buenos Aires, and knew scarcely anyone, with the exception of a person who did not bear the best of characters, and has since left. Mrs. Vaughn.'" Holy shit. She's behind all of this. And Villiers, the madman, intends to take her on. Like David versus Goliath. Chapter 8. The Fragments. Amongst the papers of the well-known physician, Dr. Robert Matheson of Ashley Street, Piccadilly, who died suddenly of apoplectic seizure at the beginning of 1892, a leaf of manuscript paper was found, covered with pencil jottings. These notes were in Latin, much abbreviated, and had evidently been made in great haste. The MS was only deciphered with difficulty, and some words have up to the present time evaded all the efforts of the expert employed. The date 25 July 1888 is written on the right-hand corner of the MS. The following is a translation of Dr. Matheson's manuscript. What? Why are we switching characters all of a sudden? See, there's something weird going on here. Whether science would benefit by these brief notes if they could be published, I do not know, but rather doubt. But certainly I shall never take the responsibility of publishing or divulging one word of what is here written. Not only an account of my oath given freely to those 2 persons who were present, but also as the details are too abominable. It is probably that, upon mature consideration, and after weighting the good and evil, I shall one day destroy this paper, or at least leave it unsealed to my friend D, trusting in his discretion to use it or burn it as he may think fit. As was befitting, I did all that my knowledge suggested to make sure that I was suffering under no delusion. At first, astounded, I could hardly think, but in a minute's time I was sure that my pulse was steady and regular, and that I was in my real and true senses. I then fixed my eyes quietly on what was before me. Though horror and revolting nausea rose up within me, and odor corruption choked my breath, I remained firm. I was then privileged or cursed, I dare not say which, to see that which was on the bed, lying there black like ink, transformed before my eyes. The skin, and the flesh, and the muscles, and the bones, and the firm structure of the human body that I had thought to be unchangeable and permanent as adamant, began to melt and dissolve. I know that the body may be separated into its elements by external agencies, but I should refuse to believe what I saw. For here there was some internal force, of which I knew nothing, that caused dissolution and change. Here, too, was all the work by which man had been made repeated before my eyes. I saw the form waver from sex to sex, dividing itself from itself, and then again reunited. Then I saw the body descend to the beast whence it ascended, and that which was on the heights go down to the depths, even to the abyss of all being. The principle of life, which makes organisms, always remains while the outward form change. The light within the room had turned to blackness, not the darkness of night, which objects are seen dimly, for I could see clearly and without difficulty. But it was the negation of light. Objects were presented to my eyes, if I may say so, without any medium, in such a manner that if there had been a prism in the room, I should have seen no colors represented in it. I watched, and at last I saw nothing but a substance as jelly. Then the ladder was ascended again. Here the missive is, MS missive, oh my god, here the missive is illegible. For one instance I saw a form, shaped in dimness before me, which I will not farther describe. But the symbol of this form may be seen in ancient sculptures, and in paintings which survive beneath the lava, too foul to be spoken of. As a horrible and unspeakable shape, neither man nor beast was changed in the human form. There came finally death. I who saw all of this, not without great horror and loathing of soul, here write my name, declaring all that I have set on this paper to be true. Robert Matheson, medical doctor. Which I believe is the same doctor in the first part of this chapter, and so I probably gave him the wrong voice. But the first doctor, who was with Clark, who experimented on Mary to show her the great god Pan. And somehow she seems to be the only one who did not go insane. But what did Matheson see, and why, and from whom? Who and what was the cause of what he saw? Such, Raymond, is the story of what I know and what I've seen. The burden of it was too heavy for me to bear alone, and yet I could tell it to none but you. Villiers, who was with me at the last, knows nothing of the awful secret of the wood, of how what we both saw die lay upon the smooth, sweet turf amidst the summer flowers, half in sun and half in shadow, and holding the girl Rachel's hand, called and summoned those companions, and shaped in solid form upon the earth we tread upon, the horror which we can but hint at, which we can only name under a figure. I would not tell Villiers of this, nor of that resemblance which struck me as with a blow upon my heart when I saw the portrait, which filled the cup of terror at the end. What this can mean I dare not guess. I know that what I saw perish was not Mary, yet in the last agony Mary's eyes looked into mine. Whether there can be any one who can show the last link in the chain of awful mystery, I do not know. But if there be anyone who can do this, you, Raymond, are the man. And if you know the secret, it rests with you to tell it or not, as you please. I am writing this letter to you immediately on my getting back to town. I've been in the country for the last few days. Perhaps you may be able to guess in which part. While the horror and wonder of London was at its height, for Mrs. Beaumont, as I have told you, was well known in society, I wrote to my friend Dr. Phillips, giving some brief outline, or rather hint, of what happened, and asked him to tell me the name of the village where the events he had related to me occurred. He gave me the name, as he said with the less hesitation, because Rachel's father and mother were dead, and the rest of the family had gone to a relative in the state of Washington 6 months before. The parents, he said, had undoubtedly died of grief and horror caused by the terrible death of their daughter, and by what I had gone before that death. On the evening of the day which I received Philip's letter, I was at Carmane, and standing beneath the moldering Roman walls, white with the winters of 1700 years, I looked over the meadow where once had stood the older temple of the god of the deeps, and saw a house gleaming in the sunlight. It was a house where Helen had lived. I stayed at Carmen for several days. The people of the palace, the people of the place, I found, knew little and I guessed less. Those whom I spoke to on the matter seemed surprised that an antiquarian, as I professed myself to be, should trouble about a village tragedy, of which they gave a very commonplace version. And, as you may imagine, I told nothing of what I knew. Most of my time was spent in the great wood that rises just above the village and climbs the hillside and goes down the river in the valley. Such another long, lovely valley, Raymond, as that on which we looked one summer night, walking to and fro before your house. For many an hour I strayed through the maze of the forest, turning now to right and now to left, pacing slowly down long alleys of undergrowth, shadowy and chill, even under the midday sun, and halting beneath great oaks. Lying on the short turf of a clearing with a faint sweet scent of wild roses came to me on the wind and mixed with the heavy perfume of the elder. His mingled odor is like the odor of the room of the dead, a vapor of incense and corruption. I stood at the edges of the wood, gazing at all the pomp and procession of the foxgloves towering amidst the bracken and shining red in the broad sunshine. Beyond them, in the deep thickets of close undergrowth, where springs boil up from the rock and nourish the water weeds, dank and evil, way too dank. But in all my wanderings, I avoided one part of the wood. It was not till yesterday that I climbed to the summit of the hill and stood upon the ancient Roman road that threads the highest ridge of the wood. Here they had walked, Helen and Rachel, along this quiet causeway, upon the pavement of green turf, shut in on either side by high banks of red earth and tall hedges of shining beech. And here I followed in their steps, looking out, now and again, through partings in the boughs, and seeing on one side the sweep of the wood stretching far to the right and left, and sinking into the broad level, and beyond, the yellow sea, and the land over the sea. On the other side was a valley, and the river, and hill following hill as a wave on wave. The wood and meadow and cornfield, the white houses gleaming, and a great wall of mountain, and far blue peaks in the north. And so at last I came to the place. The track went up a gentle slope and widened out into an open space with a wall of thick undergrowth around it, and then, narrowing again, passed on into the distance, in a faint blue mist of summer heat. Into this pleasant summer glade, Rachel passed the girl, and left it. Who shall say what? I did not stay long there. You finished Ask to Libra. Nice. How was it? How would you rate the game? Out of 10. What's your short review of the game, now that you fully finished the game? Because again, that game is fantastic. If anyone's watching and you haven't played Astra Libra, go check out my VOD. It's up on my channel down below. Astra Libra Revision. And if you're watching this VOD, listening to me read, hey, go check out that video. I'm getting better at that shilling. I'm getting better at shilling my own channel. In a small town near Carmen, there is a museum containing for the most part Roman remains which have been found in the neighborhood at various times. On the day after my arrival in Carmen, I walked over to the town in question and took the opportunity of inspecting the museum. As I had seen most of the sculptured stones, the coffins, rings, coins, and fragments of tessellated pavement which the place contains, I was shown a small square pillar of white stone, which had been recently discovered in the wood of which I have been speaking. And, as I found on inquiry, in that open space where the Roman road runs out. On the one side of the pillar was an inscription, of which I took a note. Some of the letters had been defaced, but I do not think there can be any doubts as to those which I supply. The inscription is as follows: Devam nodenti, flav silum posfer, proptern betias, quas vidit bra. To the great god Nodens, the god of the great deep or abyss, Flavius Sinless has erected this pillar on account of the marriage which he saw beneath the shade. The god of the great deep or abyss. That's a weird god to call upon. What marriage? The custodian of the museum informed me that local antiquaries were much puzzled, not by the inscription or by any difficulty in translating it, but as to the circumstance or rite to which the allusion is made. 9 out of 10. Great action, tons and tons of secrets, weapons and achievements worth the asking price. See, that's the other thing. Astral Lever is surprisingly cheap for how much value it seems to give. Like, there's a lot of like fun there if you really like a Castlevania-esque style game, but with more actual action combat mechanics and a very interesting story, IMO. At least so far in my playthrough. So that's very good to hear, actually. And now, my dear Clark, as to what you tell me about Helen Vaughn, whom you say you saw die in the circumstances of the utmost and almost incredible horror. I was interested in your account, but a good deal, nay, all of what you told me, I knew already. I can understand the strange likeness you remarked in both the portrait and in the actual face. You have seen Helen's mother. Huh? You remember that still summer night so many years ago, when I talked to you of the world beyond the shadows and of the god Pan? Do you remember Mary? She was the mother of Helen Vaughn, who was born 9 months after that night. Mary never recovered her reason. She lay, as you saw her, all the while upon her bed, and a few days after the child was born, she died. I fancy that just at the last she knew me. I was standing by the bed, and the old look came into her eyes for a second, and she shuddered and groaned and died. It was an ill work that I did that night when you were present. I broke open the door of the house of life without knowing or caring what might pass forth or enter in. I recollect you were telling me at the time, sharply enough, and rightly too, in one sense, that I had ruined the reason of a human being by a foolish experiment, based on an absurd theory. Oh my god. The person talking is the doctor who did the experiment on Mary. So like, he found out a lot more than what anyone else knew. He understood and he saw all the connections. And Clark wrote to him to say like, hey, they look familiar. And he was the one who knew Mary intimately because he's the one who adopted Mary. Holy shit. You did well to blame me. My theory was not at all absurdity. What I said Mary would see, she would saw. What I said Mary would see, she saw. But I forgot that no human eyes should look on such a sight with impunity. And I forgot, as I have just said, that when that house of life is thus thrown open, there may enter in that for which we have no name, and human flesh may become the veil of a horror one dare not express. I played with energies which I did not understand. You have seen the ending of it. Helen Vaughn did well to bind the cord about her neck and die, though the death was horrible. The blackened face, the hideous form upon the bed, changing and melting before your eyes from woman to man to beast, from beast to worse than beast. All the strange horror that you witness surprises me but little. But you say the doctor whom you sent for saw and shuddered at I noticed long ago. I know what I had done the moment the child was born, and when scarcely 5 years old I surprised it, not once or twice, but several times with a playmate. You may guess of what kind. It was for me a constant, an incarnate horror, and after a few years I felt I could bear it no more, and I sent Helen Vaughn away. You know now what frightened the boy in the wood. The rest of the strange story, and all else that you tell me, has discovered by your friend. I contrived to learn from time to time, almost to the last chapter. And now, Helen is with her companions. The end. Note, Helen Vaughn was born on August 5th, 1865 at the Red House, Breckenshire, and died on July 25th, 1888 in a house in a street off Piccadilly called Astor Street in Surrey. Of course, we know how she died. What a weird note. But that's it. That's the end of the story. What we saw, what that boy saw in the wood inside chapter 1, that was the great god Pan. And when Mary looked into that realm, she wasn't Helen Vaughn, no. But the great god Pan came to life through her. A being. It wasn't human anymore. It simply took our form, to fool us, to confuse us, to become like us. The truth is, it was at least some fragment of power, some piece of the great god Pan that had come through in such a devilish experiment. And it's fascinating, right? Now this is sort of like the book report section of like all the Ring stuff. It's fascinating how the story sort of like, you see a lot of ties and like a lot of things that we sort of see now as like staples of Lovecraftian horror. And yet when this story was like written back in like, I believe 19 something, like very, very early on. It was, because again, it was like 100 years ago. The way the story sort of tells it, and the way that the story sort of like shows you it, it's very, very, very reminiscent of the It is a hallmark of like how Lovecraftian horror is told today. It is told in illusions. It doesn't tell you outright. It keeps it as abstract as possible. It keeps you as far away as possible from what is going on. And then it lets in that horror slowly. And you realize, all too late, that what is here, we can never put back. That the door has opened. And you see a lot of this in a lot of different media, not just inside books, but also inside games and TV shows. You may recall from my Lunacid playthrough that this was a major theme of that game as well. Spoilers if you haven't seen the Lunacid, if you want to play it, maybe stop listening for 30 seconds, exactly 30 seconds, starting now. When we went into the real world, we brought the horror, the great cruel god Bagazoth with us. And with us, it caused horror in our real world. It is now taken over, and there's no way to bring it back. It's too late. And we realize it far too late when we scream without a mouth. This is terrifying. You see a lot of this stuff. I mean, even in like, Stranger Things, you like see elements of like this as well. In a lot of different things, you just see this. This is like a classic Lovecraftian horror trope. And it works very, very well. In the story too, you like rarely, or like I don't think we like ever saw any things that were very sort of like reminiscent of these older times. This author seemed to be a lot less crazy than H.P. Lovecraft, but still, I can see how this forms one of the key foundational concepts within the entire genre. This, even though it doesn't come from H.P. Lovecraft, does a very good job of doing this sort of slow build-up. I feel like even more so than H.P. Lovecraft did, at least inside the story that we read, which was The Color Out of Space. Obviously, he has more stories that we could read, but kind of hard to read them given the subject matter. I need to double check and make sure that they're very safe before I read them. But I think Arthur Machen, which is the author of the story, does a very good job of doing what H.P. Lovecraft wanted to do, but just in a better way. Though I will say, their paragraphs are so long. Holy moly, I feel so drained after that one. The paragraphs kept on going and going and going and going and going. In a weird way, I almost want a mix of the two writings, right? Which nowadays you start to see the the mix of the two writings come through. I think preferably using less words to describe what was going on may have been a bit more terrifying. But it makes sense for back then. The idea is that you slowly build on and you drone towards this terrifying state. And you slowly build up to this very terrible sort of idea of something is terribly wrong. Something has finally come through and broken this barrier between life and death. And the way to build up to it is with this long paragraph full of words just saying all kinds of things. It really is a long paragraph. It keeps on going. And notice too that just like in H.P. Lovecraft stories, they describe a lot of useless things. A lot of useless things. The look of something, the smell of something. Sorry, I keep hitting the mic. The feeling of something. It's a very interesting style of writing, being very sort of verbose in what you see. And sometimes it's worth it if it's a more sort of if it's a story trying to be very visual about something. But for this, I feel like these could have been compressed down even more. But again, I'm applying sort of stuff that I've read in stories of today to stories written back then. These are foundational things. Writing was sort of still building up at this time. And what we have today is the culmination of centuries of human learning to make a very finely crafted story that really, really hits well. Hits hard. But that was a really good book. Again, I'm left with this terrifying feeling, just similar to The Color Out Space. This feeling of what have we done? What have we brought into this world? And how long can we avoid the consequences of our actions? Of that human curiosity, of that pioneering spirit that is behind things like science, right? Yet applied to these sort of dark ritualistic things, these terrifying monstrosities, these eldritch horrors. Why do we apply that to this? That's the feeling that I get. The same feeling that I got from the Color Space. The same feeling that I get from the entire general sort of concept of Lovecraftian horror. It's a very good book. But that's all for the reading of this book. A fantastic book by Arthur Machen. Again, you can go and read it yourself too by just going to Project Gutenberg. A very wonderful place that has all these books. They compiled it for you into an ebook, so it's very easy for you to read on the go anywhere you will want. All the literary classics that have built up today into the genres that we all know and love. This is all for reading.